Imagine a winter in the late 1800s. Not the cozy, heated homes we know today, but small wooden cabins, drafty farmhouses, and crowded immigrant tenements where the cold pushed its way through every crack. In those days, soup wasn't just food, it was survival. Families depended on huge iron pots hanging over a fire, bubbling slowly all day. These pots weren't just cookware, they were the heart of the home. Children thawed their hands near the flames. Mothers stirred with wooden ladles worn thin from decades of use, and fathers returned from long, freezing workdays hoping for one thing: a warm bowl that kept the family alive. Why soups were essential in the 1800s during brutal winters. Fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to find, meat was scarce, and expensive families stretched every ingredient to its limit. Communities shared whatever they had: bones, carrots, potatoes, herbs. Soup was the perfect answer. It used fragments, leftovers, bones, peels, dried herbs, even stale bread, turning poverty into nourishment. Every family had their own method, their own secret pot, and every region had its own flavor of winter survival. The magic of the endless pot. Many homes kept a single pot continuously simmering for days or weeks. New scraps were added daily. A handful of barley, a leftover bone, a dried turnip found in storage, a small piece of salted pork, and the flavor deepened day by day. This wasn't just cooking. It was culture, tradition, and often the only thing keeping families warm in minus 20 degrees Celsius blizzards. Food was memory for settlers, farmers, immigrants, pioneers, and working-class families. Each soup carried a story of their homeland, a technique passed down generations, the hope of making it through another winter. These 25 lost soups weren't luxury meals. They were the backbone of survival, each one a forgotten recipe that once filled American cabins, frontier towns, and old-world kitchens with warmth. Before we dive into the list of lost recipes, we need to understand why soups from the 1800s were so unique and why they tasted nothing like the soups we know today. These weren't quick stovetop meals. These weren't canned, pre-mixed, or made with dozens of spices. These were slow, earthy, fire-born soups shaped by hardship, resourcefulness, and survival instincts. 1. Ingredients were raw, local, and seasonal in the 1800s. No supermarkets, no frozen goods, no imported vegetables. In winter, families relied on root vegetables stored in cellars: potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, salted meats that could last the winter, dried herbs hung from kitchen ceilings, grains like barley, buckwheat, and oats. Every ingredient had a purpose: to last long, to nourish deeply, and to stretch far. 2. Meat was a luxury. Bones were the real treasure. Most families couldn't afford fresh cuts of meat. They used leftover bones, marrow scraps, smoked pork rinds, a single ham bone reused multiple times, but those bones gave soups incredible richness, a slow, deep flavor modern broth cubes can never match. 3. Everything was cooked over fire. There were no gas stoves, no knobs to adjust heat, just wood and patience. Cooking over a hearth created smoky notes in the soup, made flavors meld slowly, required constant tending and skill, turned even simple ingredients into complex broth. This gave 1800s soups their signature rustic depth. 4. Soups were designed to feed many. A single pot often fed parents, children, grandparents, neighbors, farm workers, so soups had to be filling, be cheap, last all week, evolve every day as new scraps were added. This is why many 1800s soups were thick, hearty, almost like stew, built for survival, not for fancy dining. 5. Every culture added its own flavor. Immigrant communities shaped America's soup history. Irish brought potato soups, Germans brought cabbage and barley soups, African traditions brought okra and spice, Italians added herbs, beans, and rustic broths, Native Americans shared corn-based and foraged soups. Each spoonful was a piece of someone's homeland. 6. Soup was more than food. It was hope during harsh winters. A single pot of hot soup meant protection from sickness, energy to work, comfort during freezing nights, a reminder that spring would return. This emotional connection made 1800s soups unforgettable. Even if the recipes faded with time. In the harsh winters of the 1800s, families didn't survive because they had plenty. They survived because they knew how to make little taste like enough. Ingredients weren't chosen for luxury or flavor trends. They were chosen for endurance. Root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, carrots, and parsnips became winter heroes. They lasted for months in cold cellars, wrapped in burlap or packed in straw, waiting patiently to be dropped into bubbling pots. These humble vegetables, often overlooked today, were once the backbone of winter nourishment, turning thin broths into hearty meals that warmed chilled bones. Dried legumes played an equally vital role. Beans, peas, and lentils weren't just ingredients. They were survival tools. A single sack could feed an entire family for weeks. Mothers soaked them overnight, softening them enough to mix with whatever else the land or the season offered. These legumes brought protein, comfort, and stability to families who couldn't afford fresh meat. Their slow, steady simmer was the soundtrack of many winter mornings, echoing hope through drafty kitchens. Preserved meats were treasured like gold. In an era before refrigeration, families relied on salting, smoking, and curing to stretch valuable cuts through the winter months. A small slab of salted pork could flavor several pots of soup, transforming otherwise modest ingredients into deeply satisfying meals. Even bones from previous roasts weren't spared. They were simmered until every last bit of marrow surrendered its richness. In that age of scarcity, bones were understood not as scraps, but as an ingredient rich with life. Herbs also held a sacred place in winter cooking. Though gardens slept under blankets of snow, families dried bundles of thyme, sage, bay leaves, and parsley during the warmer months. These dried herbs brought memories of summer into the darkest days of winter. A single pinch could lift a pot of otherwise plain vegetables into something soulful. Their aroma drifting from a simmering pot gave families a feeling of comfort, small but powerful. And then there were the scraps, the overlooked remnants that modern kitchens toss without a second thought. Onion skins, carrot tops, cold bits of stale bread, leftover drippings saved in jars. They were all used with purpose. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. Every scrap carried potential. Stale bread became thickening agents. Bacon grease turned thin soups silky. Even potato peels were fried crisp or boiled down to add earthiness to broth. The ingenuity of the time wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. These ingredients weren't just components of a recipe, they reflected a philosophy. Winter cooking in the 1800s was about stretching, repurposing, respecting the land, and understanding that survival depended on resourcefulness. Families turned these humble ingredients into soups that not only fed hungry mouths, but also carried emotional warmth. Each pot told a story of resilience, reminding everyone around the table that survival was a shared effort. The ingredients of survival also revealed a deeper truth. These families didn't just cook to stay alive, they cooked to stay connected. Passing down knowledge about how to preserve meat, how to store root vegetables, how to stretch beans, and how to flavor soups with scraps created generational bonds. This wasn't fancy cooking, but it was meaningful cooking, the kind that shaped identity, community, and endurance in the face of winter's challenges. By the time a steaming bowl was placed on the table, it wasn't just soup. It was resourcefulness. It was yesterday's scraps reinvented. It was memory, effort, and hope combined. In every spoonful, families tasted the quiet triumph of making something from almost nothing, something that kept them going, season after season. Kitchens of the 1800s weren't just places to cook. They were the warm, beating heart of every home, especially in winter. When icy winds rattled wooden walls and frost clung to window panes, families gathered around the fireplace, the true stove of the era. Its flames danced with purpose, glowing against heavy cast-iron pots suspended over iron hooks. These pots rarely sat empty. Something was always simmering: broth, beans, root vegetables, or scraps saved from yesterday. The slow, gentle bubbling became a household rhythm, a quiet reassurance that warmth and nourishment were on the way. Morning routines began long before sunrise. The fire had to be revived from faint embers protected overnight beneath ash. Once flames returned to life, a pot would be placed above them to start breakfast or begin the day's soup, the dish that often carried families through the coldest months. In these kitchens, time moved differently. Nothing was fast. Everything required patience. Water heated slowly. Vegetables softened gradually. Flavors deepened with hours rather than minutes. That slow simmer was more than a cooking method. It was a way of life. Families depended heavily on whatever ingredients winter allowed. Mothers and grandmothers, wrapped in thick shawls, worked with practiced hands, chopping root vegetables or stirring pots with long wooden spoons blackened by years of fire. Children fetched wood, cracked ice from water buckets, or helped peel potatoes by the warmth of the hearth. These simple tasks weren't chores, they were rituals, handing down survival skills from one generation to the next. Cast iron cookware, heavy and indestructible, was treasured. A single pot could last decades, even lifetimes, becoming an heirloom seasoned with the flavors of hundreds of meals. That seasoning carried memories, every stew, every broth, every winter. The smell of soup filling the room brought comfort that stretched far beyond hunger. It signaled safety, routine, and togetherness during months when the outside world felt unforgiving. Winter evenings were their own kind of magic. As the sun dipped early behind snow-covered hills, the kitchen glowed in warm firelight. Families sat close, listening to the crackle of burning wood mingled with the soft bubbling of the pot. Before bedtime, the last task was always the same, ensuring the fire would survive the night. Without it, the house would greet the morning with bitter cold and no way to cook. Maintaining that flame became a symbol of resilience, a quiet triumph repeated every single day. Traditions filled these kitchens. Some families stirred soups clockwise for good luck. Others saved the first scoop for the eldest. Recipes weren't written, they were remembered. A pinch of this, a handful of that. Cooking was instinctive, shaped by stories and seasons. What mattered most wasn't perfection but presence, families sharing warmth, food, and moments that stitched their lives together. These kitchens weren't simply rooms. They were sanctuaries, where fire met food, where routine met resilience, and where families turned the bitter cold of winter into something nourishing, comforting, and deeply human. Point 1. Stone soup, traveler's version. Born from European folktales carried into early American settlements, stone soup symbolized community survival. Travelers, peddlers, and wanderers boiled a clean stone in water to spark curiosity, convincing villagers to add just one thing. A carrot here, a potato there. Soon a hearty soup emerged. Its flavor was simple and rustic, built from whatever was shared. It disappeared as travel became safer and stranger trust rituals faded. Today, it survives only as a moral tale, not a meal. 2. Rustic turnip salt pork broth. This humble soup was a winter staple for poor farming families. Turnips grew reliably in frozen soil, and salt pork scraps provided the only richness available. The broth carried a smoky, peppery aroma, warming cold kitchens. It vanished as potatoes overtook turnips in popularity and industrial meats replaced home-cured pork. By the 1900s, it was remembered only by aging farmers who once depended on its steady, earthy comfort. 3. Frontier rabbit stew soup hybrid. On the frontier, rabbits were abundant, making them an early American protein source. Families boiled rabbit bones, wild onions, and garden herbs into a thin stew soup hybrid that fed many with little. The flavor was herbal, slightly gamey, and deeply warming. It faded as hunting laws changed and rabbit fell out of culinary fashion. Modern cooks rarely consider rabbit a common table food, leaving this pioneer classic forgotten. 4. Coal miners' onion water soup. In mining towns where wages were low and meals were stretched thin, families boiled onions in salted water, sometimes enriching it with stale bread. The flavor was sharp yet soothing, a reminder of resilience in hardship. It disappeared as incomes improved and canned soups replaced bare-bones homemade broths. Though simple, this soup carried the quiet strength of families who made the most out of almost nothing. 5. Pioneer pumpkin seed soup. Early settlers wasted nothing, not even pumpkin seeds. They roasted, crushed, and boiled them into a thick, nutty soup inspired by indigenous food traditions. Its flavor resembled earthy peanut broth with hints of smoke from the hearth. It faded as pumpkins became associated with sweet dishes rather than savory meals, and seeds turned into snacks instead of sustenance. Today, only historical cookbooks mention this ingenious winter meal. 6. Tallow root vegetable soup. When meat was scarce, rendered beef tallow added richness to soups made from parsnips, turnips, and carrots. The broth tasted surprisingly hearty, with a glossy texture that warmed the bones in winter. It declined once industrial meat became common and tallow cooking fell out of favor. Modern tastes prefer lean, clean broths, leaving this old-fashioned survival soup behind. 7. Ash kettle corn broth soup. Families once cooked corn kernels in kettles hung directly over wood ash, creating a smoky broth thickened with hand-ground meal. It tasted rustic, smoky, and slightly sweet. As stoves replaced open-fire cooking, this ash kettle technique became impossible. The soup disappeared simply because the world modernized, and the smoky flavor, once a necessity, became unwanted. 8. Homestead chicken back neck soup. Before supermarkets sold pre-cut chicken, every part was used. Families simmered backs, necks, and wingtips for hours with herbs and onions, producing a surprisingly rich broth. It disappeared with the rise of butchered cuts and the decline of whole bird cooking. Today, these parts are rarely used, making this once common winter soup almost forgotten. 9. Maple cured ham bone soup. Leftover ham bones from winter curing were simmered with cabbage, potatoes, and beans, creating a sweet salty broth. The maple undertones made it unique to northern farming regions. It faded as factory-cured hams replaced home-curing traditions, and maple curing became a specialty craft rather than a normal household practice. 10. Appalachian sorghum sweet potato soup. In the Appalachian Mountains, sorghum syrup and sweet potatoes blended into a comforting, slightly sweet winter soup. Its flavor was earthy, caramel-like, and deeply satisfying. It disappeared once sugar replaced sorghum and sweet dishes overshadowed savory sweet potato recipes. Today, only mountain families recall it. 11. Fisherman's cod head soup. Coastal families boiled cod heads with potatoes, herbs, and seawater to create a delicate, briny broth. Nothing went to waste. Cheeks and collars provided tender bites. It vanished as fish markets standardized cuts and home cooks grew uncomfortable with whole fish cooking. Once a maritime staple, it is now a culinary relic. 12. Dandelion green barley soup. Before supermarkets, wild greens were a lifeline in early spring. Dandelion greens added bitterness, barley added body, and together they formed a cleansing seasonal soup. Modern lawns and pesticides pushed edible weeds out of diets, and bitter greens fell out of favor. Its memory survives only in herbal traditions. 13. Hearth-baked bread crust soup. Burnt and stale bread crusts were soaked, simmered, and blended with herbs for a surprisingly rich peasant soup. It tasted toasty, savory, and comforting. It faded when bread became mass-produced and cheap, eliminating the need to save every crust. Waste reduction shaped this dish, abundance erased it. 14. Wild mushroom snowmelt soup. Families collected winter mushrooms and melted clean snow to create a delicate forest-flavored broth. Its taste was earthy and aromatic. It disappeared as concerns about mushroom foraging safety grew and snow collection practices faded. A soup once tied to nature lost its place in modern kitchens. 15. Scrapple broth soup. Made from simmering scraps left from scrapple preparation. This broth carried deep pork flavor with hints of cornmeal. It was a winter breakfast for many Pennsylvania households. As scrapple declined outside local cultures, this broth vanished as well. Today, only regional cooks know it existed. 16. Molasses navy bean broth. Inspired by sailor rations, families simmered beans with a spoonful of molasses for sweetness and energy. The flavor was smoky and slightly caramelized. It disappeared when molasses fell out of mainstream cooking and canned baked beans took over. Its maritime history remains largely forgotten. 17. Oxtail turnip leaf soup. Cooking oxtail with leafy greens created a gelatin-rich broth cherished for healing during winter. It tasted hearty and silky. As tail cuts became expensive and greens less appreciated, this dish slipped from everyday meals into obscurity. Today, it appears only in niche culinary circles. 18. Boiled wheat berry herb soup. Before rice became universal, wheat berries were a common staple. Families cooked them into a chewy, herb-infused soup for long-lasting energy. It faded once polished grains took over and wheat berries became specialty items. A once ordinary pioneer dish is now a historical footnote. 19. Smoked turkey neck winter broth. Turkey necks smoked during autumn harvests provided deep flavor in winter soups. The broth was rich, peppery, and hearty. As smoking traditions faded and necks became undervalued cuts, the soup went with them. Commercial holiday turkeys replaced slow-cured, home-smoked meats. 20. Rustic millet carrot soup. Millet, an old-world grain, thickened winter soups long before cornmeal became widespread. Carrots added sweetness and color. Its flavor was mild and rustic. It disappeared as millet lost popularity to wheat and corn, becoming birdseed instead of people food. Culinary fashion alone erased it. 21. Winter cabbage vinegar soup. A tangy soup inspired by Eastern European settlers, made from cabbage, onion, and a splash of vinegar. The taste was sharp, warming, and refreshing. It faded as creamy soups rose in popularity and sour broths became less common. Only old country families kept the tradition alive. 22. Potato skin herb broth. Nothing was wasted. Potato skins were boiled with sage and thyme to create a surprisingly flavorful broth. It tasted earthy and herbal. As convenience replaced frugality and peeled potatoes became standard, this broth vanished. Modern wastefulness erased an ingenious survival food. 23. Venison bone winter stock. Hunters simmered deer bones with wild herbs to produce a hearty winter soup essential in frontier communities. Its flavor was robust and woodsy. It disappeared when hunting declined, store-bought meat increased, and venison became niche rather than necessary. 24. Salted cod milk soup. When salted cod was soaked overnight, families saved the cloudy soaking milk to make a thin soup with onions and potatoes. The taste was briny and slightly creamy. It vanished as salted cod declined and fresh fish became accessible. A once common fisherman's soup is now forgotten. 25. Roasted garlic bone marrow soup. Roasted garlic and marrow bones created a deeply rich winter broth cherished for healing and warmth. Its flavor was buttery, savory, and restorative. As modern diets avoided marrow and simple broths, this dish faded. Once a symbol of winter nourishment, it survives only in high-end culinary revivals. If you flip through the fragile diaries left behind by frontier families, one thing becomes clear. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a test of spirit. And soups, simple as they were, often held entire stories inside a single steaming bowl. In an 1837 journal from a Tennessee homestead, a mother wrote about making poor man's broth for her children during a storm so fierce it shook the shutters loose. She boiled whatever she had, potato skins, a pinch of herbs, and a scrap of pork fat, and described how the children huddled around the pot, their faces glowing in the firelight. It warmed more than our hands, she wrote. It warmed our hope. Another story comes from an elderly woman in Nebraska who recounted her grandmother's winter rituals. Each dawn, before the family awoke, her grandmother would stoke the fire, set a cast-iron pot over the embers, and drop in dried beans saved from the fall harvest. She described the sound of those beans hitting the pot as the heartbeat of the house. By midday, the aroma filled the single-room cabin, promising comfort after hours of bone-cold labor outdoors. That smell, she said, was the closest thing to safety. Travel diaries from wagon trails also reveal how soup bound strangers together. One traveler wrote about sharing a small pot of rabbit bone broth with a family he met near the Platte River. They had hardly anything left, just a handful of onions and the last rabbit of the season. Still, they insisted he join them. He recalled the taste as thin but honest, a kind of kindness made edible. Years later, he still remembered the warmth of that night more than the food itself. Oral histories from Appalachian communities speak of grandmothers who could make a feast out of almost nothing. One recalled her granny simmering sorghum sweet potato soup during winters when snow piled against the door. She would tell stories as the pot bubbled, tales of ancestors, storms survived, and blessings counted. It wasn't just soup, the woman said. It was our family history simmering. These stories remind us that winter soups weren't merely food. They were memory, survival, and love stretched as far as it could go. They fed bodies, yes, but more importantly, they fed spirits. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the landscape of food in America was shifting rapidly. The rise of industrialization meant that more people moved to cities, leaving behind farms and rural communities where these winter soups had been a staple. No longer were families growing, harvesting, and preserving every ingredient by hand. Instead, canned goods, mass-produced staples, and later, supermarkets offered convenience that slowly replaced the labor-intensive traditions of survival cooking. These lost soups, once brimming with the season's root vegetables, fresh herbs, and preserved meats, now faced stiff competition. Changing tastes played a big role too. As global trade introduced new flavors and packaged foods became cheaper, American palates shifted towards sweetness, convenience, and novelty. The hearty, sometimes gritty, and resourceful soups that defined frontier winters felt old-fashioned to younger generations. Many recipes vanished simply because they weren't being passed down. The decline of farm culture accelerated this disappearance. Families no longer raised their own livestock or grew sprawling gardens. Ingredients that were once abundant, like turnips, winter squash, and dried legumes, became harder to source in urban areas. What was once a creative act of frugality, using scraps, bones, and seasonal vegetables, turned into a lost art, overshadowed by store-bought meats, prepackaged broths, and instant soups. In many ways, this shift mirrors the contrast between old hardship and present comfort. Where early Americans faced long winters with nothing but ingenuity, modern households reach for pre-made options in minutes. The very soups that once brought families together by the hearth now serve as relics of a time when survival demanded patience, skill, and cooperation. Each lost recipe is a reminder that convenience has its costs. The disappearance of tradition, community knowledge, and the simple joy of creating a meal from scratch. Yet, while these soups faded from daily life, their stories linger in diaries, cookbooks, and oral histories. They serve as a silent testament to resilience, a quiet nudge reminding us that our ancestors' kitchens were more than just a place to eat. They were centers of innovation, resourcefulness, and survival. When we think about these lost winter soups, it's easy to focus on the ingredients, the flavors, or the clever ways families stretched every morsel. But what truly disappeared alongside these recipes goes far beyond taste. It's a whole way of life, a network of traditions and values that nourished both body and soul. In 1800s America, preparing a winter soup wasn't just about sustenance. It was a community ritual. Families gathered around fireplaces, chopping vegetables, tending simmering pots, and sharing stories. Neighbors swapped ingredients or recipes, creating a web of support in times of scarcity. Each bowl carried with it a sense of connection, a shared acknowledgement that survival depended on cooperation and creativity. When these soups vanished, so too did these informal gatherings, these moments of shared labor and laughter. Family unity suffered a similar fate. Preparing a hearty soup required patience, timing, and collaboration. Children learned to peel, stir, and season. Elders taught techniques honed over decades, and everyone contributed. The kitchen became a classroom of resilience, where life lessons were passed along with ladles of broth. Today, with prepackaged meals and microwaves, that quiet, hands-on learning has almost disappeared. The younger generation rarely experiences the pride of crafting a meal that could literally keep a family alive through harsh winter months. We also lost a deep gratitude for simplicity. Every root vegetable, leftover bone, or pinch of herb was treated with care because it mattered. Wastage was unthinkable, and every meal celebrated what was available. Modern convenience has dulled this appreciation. Supermarkets constantly supply abundance, and many meals no longer require imagination or thriftiness. In losing these soups, we've also lost an intimate connection to the cycles of the land and the rhythm of the seasons. Finally, these lost soups carried a heritage, an edible memory of regional flavors, immigrant traditions, and frontier ingenuity. Each recipe told a story, linking generations and preserving the character of a time long gone. Without them, a piece of cultural identity fades, it becomes harder to understand how our ancestors endured, celebrated, and connected through food. Rediscovering these soups is not just about recreating flavors. It's about reviving community, gratitude, and skill. Every stirring pot is a bridge to the past, a chance to reclaim lessons that modern life often overlooks. The disappearance of these soups reminds us that food is never just food. It's a vessel for culture, resilience, and human connection. While these lost winter soups may have vanished from daily tables, their spirit is quietly returning through modern movements that celebrate tradition, craftsmanship, and connection to the land. Across America and beyond, chefs, homesteaders, and food enthusiasts are rediscovering old recipes, breathing life into forgotten flavors, and asking a simple yet powerful question: why let these soups stay lost? The farm-to-table revival is perhaps the most natural avenue for their return. Small farms, community gardens, and local markets are providing fresh, seasonal ingredients reminiscent of the 1800s. Root vegetables, dried legumes, preserved meats, and herbs, once staples of survival soups, are now celebrated for their taste, sustainability, and nutritional value. Enthusiastic home cooks and professional chefs alike are experimenting with these ingredients, reimagining lost recipes while honoring their historical roots. Imagine a warm pioneer pumpkin seed soup served at a modern pop-up dinner, bridging centuries with every spoonful. Then there's the slow food movement, a global push against instant meals and industrialized convenience. Its philosophy aligns perfectly with the old ways, cooking thoughtfully, wasting nothing, and savoring each bite. Slow food festivals now showcase dishes that could have been pulled straight from a frontier kitchen, and workshops teach families to preserve, ferment, and cook from scratch. These experiences not only revive recipes, they recreate the rituals and community spirit that originally accompanied them. Homesteading trends are another hopeful avenue. People are returning to self-sufficiency, learning to grow, harvest, and preserve food as their ancestors did. Blogs, YouTube channels, and social media are full of guides for resurrecting forgotten soups, using bones for stock, turning scraps into broths, and blending herbs with seasonal vegetables. These platforms allow history to meet modernity, giving lost recipes a digital lifeline and inspiring a new generation of cooks to value patience, resourcefulness, and flavor. The emotional appeal is strong too. In an era of fast food and instant gratification, there's a hunger for connection, nostalgia, and authenticity. Preparing a lost winter soup is more than a culinary experiment. It's a journey into history. Families can gather around the stove, children can learn age-old techniques, and every simmering pot becomes a bridge between past and present. Of course, not every recipe can return unchanged. Some ingredients are rare, and modern palates may require adaptation. But even small revivals, stone soup on a school playground, coal miner's onion water soup at a themed dinner, or rustic turnip broth at a local farm-to-table restaurant, bring these lost culinary treasures back into the cultural conversation. In short, these soups can return, not just as food, but as experiences, lessons, and traditions. Through intentional cooking, community effort, and a desire to connect with the past, what was once lost can simmer back to life, offering warmth, flavor, and a taste of resilience that today's fast-paced world sorely needs. The story of these lost winter soups is more than just a tale of ingredients and recipes. It is a story of resilience, creativity, and human connection. In the harsh winters of 1800s America, families relied on whatever they could find, preserve, or forage, transforming humble vegetables, scraps of meat, and dried legumes into meals that nourished both body and spirit. Each soup carried with it a history of survival, community, and ingenuity, a tradition that bound generations together around the warmth of a kitchen hearth. Today, many of these recipes have faded into memory, replaced by convenience, industrialization, and modern tastes. Yet the disappearance of these soups reminds us of what was lost along with them: family rituals, gratitude for simple meals, and a deep connection to the land and its seasons. Rediscovering these recipes isn't just about tasting the past. It's about reclaiming the values they embodied: frugality, creativity, and togetherness. There is hope. Through the farm-to-table movement, slow food initiatives, and the growing interest in homesteading and self-sufficiency, these soups can return, not as relics, but as living traditions. Each recreated recipe offers a chance to connect with history, to gather family or friends, and to savor the simple, comforting flavors that sustain generations. So the next time you stir a pot of rustic broth or simmer a handful of root vegetables, remember, you are not just cooking. You are honoring resilience, preserving heritage, and reviving stories that once kept families warm through long, unforgiving winters. Which of these forgotten soups would you want to try first?